Good. Yes. Hello, everybody. This is our ninth meeting. Good heavens. Um, Now, it's about now that we thought that it would start tailing off, as I've said before, and, we could get back our Sunday afternoons. But no, it's popped up again. And we sold certainly 90 odd tickets for this one. And in fact, some people liked it so much that they signed in twice, which Martin's going to tell you off for in a minute. But today, we got a wonderful lineup of Vic Gammon, Cara O'Brien, Anne Lederman, and Irene Shettle. So we're going to go to England, America, Canada, and Ireland, all in the space of the next hour and a bit. The next meeting will be September the 20th, so that's in a fortnight's time. And the lineup will be John Baxter, Elaine Bradkey, Bob Askew, and Steve Gardam. So that gives us music hall songs, a singing fiddle player, Robin Hood ballads, and how to find the earliest versions of all our folk songs. So that's an amazing lineup we have for you coming up on the 20th, that's Sunday week. Now, Martin wants to say something about our YouTube channel, and he's going to tell you off or tell you the rules. Martin.
All right, I'll do it all now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll do the thing about double booking first. We do run to a limited number of people, and this time we really are right up to the top end of our capacity. The fact that 6 people booked 2 tickets meant we actually got 6 back because we were sold out yesterday evening because of that. So I've been able to let a few more people in today. You don't need to book twice. If there are 2 of you, you only need 1 screen, in case that's not absolutely clear, as it was in one case. But please be careful. The other thing is email addresses. If you put the wrong email address into Eventbrite when you book, you may still get a booking confirmation because it will send it to the email address that you actually logged into Eventbrite with. So please check your email addresses very carefully. I had some returns yesterday, returned emails, because the email address was not right. So please check your email address carefully when you put it into Eventbrite. The other piece of news, Steve mentioned the videos. As you know, or at least as many of you know, we have created a Traditional Song Forum YouTube channel, which contains some very useful instructional videos on how to use Steve's index and also how to use the traditional ballad index. They have been joined last week by another 5 videos which I've made of talks I have given in the past. So you will find all those on the TSF YouTube channel on a range of topics, from the War of 1812 right through to broadside ballads in Cirencester. And there will be more. And then the other piece of news is those of you who follow these things regularly know that we have the Roy Palmer Lecture annually, which was set up in memory of Roy, who was a great enthusiast for the stuff we do. Died 5 years ago. And the Roy Palmer Lecture was set up to commemorate him and to give someone a platform to talk about things that he liked to talk about. This year's should have been given in London at the end of this month, but unfortunately that lecture has had to be postponed. And after scrambling around a bit, we have taken advantage of the technology And this year's Roy Palmer lecture is going to be given by Jeff Warner from his home in Portsmouth, the other Portsmouth, on old songs for new folk, interpreting the tradition for lay audiences. And that will take over this meeting on the 29th of November. So put that one in your diary, could likely to be well populated. And details of all these things will appear on the newsletter that I send out on Wednesday, probably, and on the Traditional Song Forum website. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Martin. And the mention of Roy Palmer, we got some of Roy talks, recordings of talks that Roy gave, papers that he gave. If anybody's got any photos of Roy, I'd appreciate them, because if you put things on YouTube, of course, you've got to have some sort of visual to go with the sound. So some photos of Roy would be much appreciated. Please contact me, steveroud@gmail.com. Okay, enough of the parish notices. We're going to go straight into the meeting now with Vic Gammon. Are you still there, Vic? You've gone off my screen, but I presume you are. Oh, there you are.
I'm still here.
Over to you, Vic.
Right, I've got to share a screen. Hang on, let's
Yeah.
see if this works. Oh, it's looking promising.
Yeah.
Does that look like anything?
Yes, it does. 18th century sources, it says.
Oh, yeah, it's on the wrong slide. Never mind. It's a good thing. Now, a slideshow. Okay, and you can see that's...
Yes.
Right, good. Okay, fine. Good. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. Nice to
Slideshow.
see so many friendly faces, some at great distance. Okay, I was asked by a friend of mine, some of you know her, Ruth Perry in Boston, if I knew anything about this verse of the song. Hard is the fortune of all womankind. She's always controlled. She's always confined.
Vic,
Yes?
do you know you haven't started your slideshow?
Oh. Well, I thought I had. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Right. Is that better?
We still have the...
Not yet.
Ah.
We still have the first slide.
Well, we don't. We've got the...
Hang on. It says resume share. I thought something. Sharing is being paused. Bring your shared window to the front. I've done that.
You might be sharing the wrong screen, Vic. The wrong window, because we see the whole thing as opposed to the actual slideshow.
Right. I've got the slideshow up.
Just click it again.
Stop sharing and try again.
I've definitely got the whole thing up.
Try full screen on the upper right-hand corner.
Okay. No, disappeared completely now.
Vic, stop sharing and try again.
All right.
That's it.
You've got it, have you?
Yeah.
Good. Fine. I'll start again and you can all see this.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I was asked by a friend to look into this verse. I think she was asked by somebody, and I spent a sort of happy afternoon looking at possible sources of this verse, and I thought it would make quite a nice presentation for this as a 10-minute sort of do for this event. I mean, it's an interesting verse in that it's one of those statements of something like enduring truth. You know, it's a sort of verity. You do get this in traditional songs sometimes. Many's the dark and cloudy morning turns out to be a bright sunshiny day. Love is handsome, love is fine, love's a jewel when it is new, and so on. I mean, those sort of verses crop up in traditional songs, and this is a particularly strong and interesting one. It's a sort of statement of the position of women in a patriarchal society, and certainly England of the pre-industrial period was that. It's also got the theme in the larger song, the theme of parental opposition. So let's just have a look at the song itself. I did send out some links for you to listen to it, so you've no doubt got Doc Watson or Buell Kazee ringing in your ears. So you've got this statement to start with of eternal truth, and then a verse, I'm a poor girl, my fortune is sad. Now this sounds familiar because most of you probably know the song The Blackbird. If I was a blackbird, I'd whistle and sing. It's pretty much the same verse. You've then got a verse, my parents don't like him because he is poor. I think this may be a descendant verse. I'll look at this later from the older song, but I don't know. One of the interesting things about this verse is that it can be, the gender can totally reverse. You can sing it, your parents don't like me, and some versions do that. And then you get this this sort of dialogue pair of verses. I've tried to show that in the colour here. Your horses are hungry, go feed them some hay. This is an attempt to delay the departure of this man who's going away. But when you look at it, I mean, the first verse doesn't actually seem to me to have a great deal to do with the second verse, which is a sort of quasi-narrative. It's almost a narrative. It's statement of a position. I'm poor, and now the bloke I like is going away. Parents don't like him. You know, it seems to be. I'm not saying I don't like the song. I do like the song. I think it's an excellent song. But there's a sort of incoherence in the text, which is interesting. In terms of its 20th century history, it's quite easy to trace. It was picked up by a lot of collectors around the early years of the 20th century in the USA. Sharp has about 5 or 6 versions of it in Folk Songs of the Southern Appalachians. It was recorded in 1928 by Buell Kazee, who was a banjo-playing Baptist minister. It got into the Harry Smith anthology, which was singularly the most important, I think, element in the US folk revival of the 1950s, and then in the 1960s was recorded by Joan Baez, and then by lots of other people, as you've seen. So it really has a 20th century life, which is quite dynamic, usually pretty much in this version. When you look at the older traditional versions, they are very diverse. They've got all sorts of elements in them which this song doesn't have, but this one is the one that's come through. Okay, well, what I found, and I wasn't the first to find this, I'll say a bit more about that later, is that the song crops up in numerous 18th century songbooks. Just the first verse, sometimes a second verse. If you look at the Ladies' Case Set by Mr. Googe, there's this second verse. Though fondly we love, we dare not reveal, we secretly languish, compelled to conceal, denied every freedom of life to enjoy. We're shamed if we're kind, we're blamed if we're coy. Not the most memorable verse compared with the one that we know, but it's actually a very interesting thought that is there. Okay, and it's not only, there are just a few examples of this setting with the tune in 18th century songbooks, and there are more. And my screen seems to have frozen. Right. I've just put up some publications here. You can see it's printed pretty much from the 1730s all the way through the 18th century. Usually in the sort of form you see on the left. It's just the couple of verses. These are essentially fairly expensive middle class songbooks, songs or books of song texts, and they're not really made for popular consumption and so on. Okay, so there we are. That's the song circulating quite widely in the 18th century in this particular sort of fairly affluent middle class sort of milieu. What we know is the song is probably by Henry Carey. It's included in his ballad opera, The Country Bumpkin, which didn't succeed. It was produced in 1730. It was that particular piece was, and of course, bear in mind that's just after the Beggar's Opera. He converted it from an earlier play, Hanging and Marriage, which Sheila and I tried to read together, and it's a ridiculous piece. It really is. Lots of sort of fights and things going on. The sort of thing, I mean, it's a farce, and you wouldn't expect something to so interesting as that verse to come out of that piece, but it did. And people had got there before. That's the one thing when you do some research, is that you find that people had actually done the work and got there before you. And Lisa Null, who uses her posh name on the on notes for albums. Steve Gardam, I had a interesting conversation with Steve, and he could have given this talk off the top of his head pretty much. And of course the wonderful lamented Bruce Olson, who had also in his contributions to the Mudcat, he'd realised this was a piece by Henry Carey. Henry Carey was a playwright, a songwriter. The piece you'll know by him is Sally in Our Alley. It became a sort of standard national song almost. And there we are. Now, whether he wrote it or whether he adapted it, I'm not sure, but we think it's certainly that's there. And here's the really interesting piece of evidence which shows another method of song dissemination. This is the songs as they are sung in Betty or the Country Bumpkins at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, given gratis at the theatre. And there is our verse right as Air One. It opens the play. The Country Bumpkin hasn't survived. The earlier play survived, and as I say, we had a look at it, and it really is I'm not surprised it failed even in the 18th century. But it's interesting, it's a free song sheet. It says something about the way in which songs are communicated, that they are given away free to the audience on a sheet, and given gratis at the theatre. They're making quite a point of that. Okay, so let's just have a look at another couple of aspects. I mean, is that my parents don't like him because he is that a descendant verse? There's another verse to the some of the versions of the Carey piece. O fortune we have, O then we must be joined to the man that is by our parents designed, compelled for to have the man we never see, no matter if ugly or handsome he be. Again, an interesting verse. The question I would have is, are these two later verses, one from a Vaughan Williams collected version of the Blackbird, my true love is handsome in every degree, my parents despise him because he loves me, and let them despise him and say what they will, while there's breath in my body, I loves the boy still. Obviously there's a link between that and the third verse down, the Bayers version. I'm not so sure that there's a link between the Carey version, and it seems to me that we can make suppositions. We really don't know. Okay, and this is part of a wider complex. The Wagoner Lad overlaps with a load of other songs, and I've tried to give a partial picture of that. Quite clearly there's this bottom left, an overlap with I Was a Blackbird. That doesn't seem to be around much before the late 19th century at least. That is a descendant. There's some verses in The Darling Boy, which is a song that's around Pitt Catnach's time in the 1820s, 30s. And that seems to have some sort of overlap, but it's not particularly the verses we're interested in. So Harden is the Fortune is clearly an overlap with the Wagoner Lad. But there's another stream that comes down that certainly influences the American versions. That's Some Tyrant Has Stolen My True Love Away, which begins in the 17th century. And certainly goes through. It sort of disappears for a long time and then comes back, and it gets tied into versions of the Top of Old Smoky verses, meeting is a pleasure, parting is a grief. So you really have that sort of tremendous. I mean, I really feel sorry for Steve Roud. How do you sort out songs like this? How do you give them an index number when they're actually all mixed up in this way? I seem to have stuck again. Oh no. Okay. So just a few things to finish off with. I mean, I think I like some of these songs that are just, in a sense, made up of different bits. Ian Russell, in an earlier talk, talked about layers of meaning, ambiguity, and ambivalence, and I think that's right, and that's why some of the songs really derive their power from that. So it's an error to think that coherence is to do with origins. Coherence can exist because things come together and make a constellation. And make something, and it's partly that we interpret the songs, that we receive them, we create their meaning, but within our own cultural horizons and expectations. What's interesting, looking at again and again at early printed versions, is that variations occur in print as well as in oral tradition. It's absolutely the case. And one final thought is that the perspective here, which is historical and comparative, is very different from traditional encounters with the material. We can't help that. In a sense, that's our authenticity. We don't need to worry about it. But I always feel there's sometimes within the folk movement some sort of tension over that sort of thing. That's all I've got to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vic. That was wonderful. Excellent. Great start to today. As before, we're going to take questions at the end, questions for all four. But thank you for saying how you feel sorry for me and my indexing, because this kind of song should be banned off the face of the earth because it really doesn't fit. But we'll come on to that later. Right, we're going to carry on straight on to Cara. Do you want to unmute yourself, Cara? I think Cara's next.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I'm gonna, So how do I share my screen with you?
Martin, are you there?
Says it's disabled at the moment.
So
Martin's
just
on.
looking on it, it went a bit weary.
Ah, no worries.
Is anything happening? I'd say talk amongst yourselves, but that would be a really silly thing to say.
I think it's working now. Hold on. All right, perfect.
Right, we have the first. We have Trapping the Undaunted Fox.
Perfect. Hopefully that's working. All right. So I picked a topic which is way too big for 10 minutes. So this is an abridged version, I'm afraid. But here goes. The Pursuit of Farmer Michael Hayes, which is Roud 5226, tells of a tenant farmer who goes on the run after being evicted and is chased across a rather spectacular amount of Ireland before finally escaping to America. The narrator refers to himself as a bold, undaunted fox and frames the story as a hunt in which hounds and huntsmen are continually outsmarted by the wily fox. According to the song, the persecuted man is the farmer who, quote, lived as happy as King Saul and loved his neighbors great and small and had no animosity for either friend or foe, unquote. A good tenant unfairly evicted in spite of being ready to pay his rents, rates, and taxes. It is an intriguing combination of a classic fox hunting song and a uniquely Irish narrative of a rebel on the run, equal parts Kilruddery Hunt and Ned of the Hill. The image of a man being hunted down with hounds is particularly disturbing and makes the ballad a haunting depiction of inequality and abuse of power, which still resonates with singers and audiences today. But the history of Farmer Michael Hayes is complex and at its core is an event which defies tidy classifications. The song's inspiration was a true event in which a land agent was murdered, not by a regular tenant, but by his former bailiff, a man who carried out many evictions on behest of the agent. Hayes' reputation for violence was well known, and Tom Munnelly tells us that Hayes' own eviction occurred because the agent, quote, did not want a ruffian on his land, end quote. Yet within a few years of the event, Michael Hayes had become a folk hero, and at least 2 different ballads were being sung in his honor. This paper attempts to trace this history and show how the story of Michael Hayes fitted into major socio-political narratives of the time. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, July 30th, 1862, James Waller Bradell Esquire, land agent to Colonel Hare, was receiving rents in a back room of Dobbin's Hotel in Tipperary. Present in the room was Daniel Moore, Mr. Bradell's bailiff, and a tenant, James Reardon. It was stated at the inquest that Michael Hayes entered the room and, quote, asked Mr. Bradell to allow him to remain on the land he held and to have it at the same rent which he had always paid, end quote. Upon being told that Mr. Bradell would not discuss the matter, Hayes produced a pistol and shot Mr. Bradell. In the ensuing chaos, Michael Hayes escaped. Mr. Bradell died the following day after signing a declaration that Hayes was the cause of his demise. The press, as they say, had a field day. Why are you skipping? There we go. The period from 1850 to 1880 was relatively peaceful in terms of agrarian violence, and eviction levels were low, but the memory of the Great Famine was too recent to be ignored. Tenant-landlord relations were increasingly being tested, and the notion of tenant rights, which first appeared in the 1830s, was steadily gaining ground. In addition, despite a generally prosperous economic trend through 1870, R.F. Foster tells us that the period from 1859 to 1864 was one of severe agricultural depression. Society was caught between fears of agrarian unrest and a growing support for tenants in the wake of the famine. The twin preoccupation is visible in the newspaper reports of the incident. Even before the actual death of Mr. Bradell, the incident was labeled an agrarian outrage. The Belfast newsletter confidently called Mr. Bradell the latest victim of the bloodthirsty system of Ribbonism. Ribbonism was a generally pro-Catholic, anti-landlord agrarian movement active throughout the 1800s. There is nothing to suggest that either Hayes or Bradell was associated with Ribbonism, and indeed it seems unlikely given their professions. A.C. Murray has argued, however, that Ribbonism was a convenient catch-all for post-famine agrarian crime. Quote, to blame their almost complete failure to apprehend agrarian criminals, most notably murderers, upon the Ribbon Society, in part absolved both the local and central authorities, excused the incompetence and apathy of the majority of magistrates, and the antiquated and inefficient police methods, while at the same time enabling officials to plead for extraordinary measures in order to deal with agrarian crime, end quote. But as Hayes continued to elude the police, a different picture was presented. The Wexford People, a regional paper which still runs today, shifted its scrutiny to Bradell, who, quote, as a land agent had turned 1,200 perished by the crowbar, for the bailiff that did his bad work in these years was the man that slew him, end quote. While I think we must view these eviction numbers with some skepticism, the shift in perspective is notable. Although some papers continue to blame Ribbonism, others began to play up Hayes' advanced age, which is thought to have been around 70 at the time of the murder. One paper gave a moving account of how, quote, as the years went on, the bailiff grew old and stiff in the limbs, and the agent deprived him of his place and gave it to a younger and stronger man, end quote. In spite of his supposed infirmity, Hayes stubbornly remained unfound. Sightings and even alleged arrests were reported regularly for several months, but eventually waned. In 1865, 3 years after Hayes went on the run, it was reported that he had died of exposure on the mountains of Slieve na Mon. The newspapers did not sound particularly confident in this statement, but I have been unable to locate sightings after this date. In November of that year, a ballad singer was arrested and given 7 days hard labor for singing a seditious ballad entitled The General Fox Chase, which referred to the pursuit of the Fenian prisoners. Of course, the report did not include the lyrics, but Slightly later broadsides suggest that this was indeed the song we now call Farmer Michael Hayes. There were at least 2 Hayes ballads around this time, The General Fox Chase, and another song called The Gallant Farmer's Farewell to Ireland, which is Roud 4359. The 2 songs are similar, but the second lacks the fox hunt framework and is much more explicit about the story of Michael Hayes. It is clear, however, that The General Fox Chase was by far the more popular song, possibly because the image of the fox hunt suggested powerful landlords being duped at their own game. In 1883, a slightly bemused correspondent for the Pall Mall Gazette wrote of an Irish marketplace, quote, "On the other side of the square, some uncompromising Celt is lauding the virtues of a true Tipperary man, whose title to eternal regard of a grateful country lies in his having slain an agent in broad day and escaped. He was a bold, undaunted fox," says the singer admiringly, end quote. It seems likely that Hayes himself would have been equally bemused to hear this account of his exploits and to learn that he had any title to the eternal regard of a grateful country. But by then, his status as a rebel hero was cemented. George Zimmerman, who furthered Hayes' career as a rebel when he included the song in his 1967 book, Songs of the Irish Rebellion, stated that the ballad, quote, "shows how a probably hateful character could become a gallant hero in the eyes of oppressed peasants." Tom Munnelly echoed this sentiment, quote, "In the eyes of the Irish folk, one could be forgiven anything for shooting a landlord or one of his agents, and they tend to forget that Hayes had been a particularly vicious bailiff himself," end quote. He was referring to Tom Linehan's version of the story, recorded by Munnelly in 1989, which cast Hayes as a tenant unfairly evicted in the act of actually trying to pay his rents. John Lyons tells a version in 1972 in which it is the landlord rather than his agent who is killed. From the moment of his escape, the story of Michael Hayes has been continually twisted and changed to fit various socio-political narratives, and perhaps it is exactly this flexibility which has made the song and its hero so enduring. Whatever his actual fate, it seems doubtless that Farmer Michael Hayes will live on for many years as the bold, undaunted fox. The end.
Thank you, Cara. Excellent. Thank you. And very timely as well. Great.
I timed it at least. No.
Yes.
Let's see.
And I didn't hear the cleaners in the background either.
Oh, that's good. They were definitely rattling around.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. Questions for Cara later on. And we're moving on to Anne. Anne Lederman, are you there?
Hi. Yes.
Hello, Anne.
Just unmuted. Okay, I have to share my screen also. One participant can share at a time. I'm getting a bunch of options. I'm not sure what to do with multiple participants can share. Okay.
Bad.
Yes. And I'm not finding my PowerPoint as an option here. It worked when I tried this earlier. Files. That seems odd. Why would that not be an option? Let's just see if I can pull it up.
Yes, we have something.
Well, you have my Finder, but you don't have my
We
PowerPoint.
don't, no.
Okay,
Maybe.
here we are. I got it. I'm just going to change the view. So far, so good? Yes, are you seeing the Songs of Old Ontario?
No, not yet.
Oh, it's up on my screen.
Still just seeing your list of files.
That's weird because it's up on my screen, so now I don't know what to do. Let me try stopping the share and we'll try it again. I'm fairly new to PowerPoint.
Now we have it.
Yes, all right. Here we go. Yes, so I thought it would be fun just to introduce some songs from my part of the world, from Canada. We have many English language songs, which go back to the British Isles. At first I thought I'd do a general thing on Ontario songs and realized that would be impossible. So I just chose 3 well-known songs that have some unusual aspects. Either the tune is different than we've heard here before, words have been changed, or in some cases it's a slightly rare, older version of the song. So most of what I'm presenting today comes from the work of Edith Folk, who is the main collector in Ontario. I've just thrown up pictures of a couple of her many publications. Not only was she a collector, but a great compiler of work from collections all over Canada. As you can see, she would put out general books of Canadian songs, Canadian folklore, Canadian tales. Those album covers are just 2 of the Folkways albums that were made from her collections. Okay, what I'm talking about today largely comes from a really old article from 1963, and so that's really all the information that I have in terms of the, what she collected and what she thought the overall picture was. Not a huge amount of new collecting has gone on since then, believe it or not. So this may still be relatively accurate. I'm guessing that some more songs were added to this canon later. As you'd note here, I'm not going to read everything on the slide, but 4/5 of the songs she thinks go back to Great Britain. There's a bit of information there about the populations in Ontario. I think the thing to note there is how new it really is. We've really only been here for a couple hundred years. And then the little list at the bottom. By this point, she had found 16 child ballads, 122 broadsides listed in laws, and 95 that were kind of unique to Canada. Okay, first song. This one, you will all know versions of it. This particular version, as you can see, is really long. It goes back to an older form in which it was a group of gypsies and in which it does not end happily. I don't have a field recording of this, so I'm just going to sing you the first couple of verses to give you an idea. It goes more or less like this. 7 gypsies on yon hill, they were neither bright nor bonny, oh, but they sang so sweet with the changing of their notes that they stole Lord Castle's lady, oh. When Lord Castle he came home, he inquired for his lady, oh. But the waiting maid, she thus replied, she's gone with a gypsy laddie, oh. And then it goes on, there's tons of repetition. He goes east and west, he meets the old man who goes east and west, he goes east and west some more, he finally finds his lady, until we get to what I consider the emotional crux of the song in verse 9. No, I won't come home, my dear, she said. No, I won't come home, my honey, oh, for I'd rather have a kiss from a gypsy laddie's lips than all Lord Castle's body, oh. At which point, it's no surprise that they end up dying at the end. All right. So there's that one. I'm going to breeze through this all fairly quickly. I can make the PowerPoint available to anyone who's interested later. The tune is available in a couple of Edith's publications, but I couldn't lay my hands on the field recording. Okay. Lorena Clark was probably Edith's biggest informant. This was a gold mine for Edith when she met Lorena. She was quite an interesting woman, learned songs from many members of her family, and as you can see, had a very mixed heritage, lived in many different parts of Canada. The picture over here is a book of songs that was done, not all of her songs, but a selection not too long ago. and this is one of her many albums. Edith was responsible for helping get some of those albums made, but Lorena herself just churned out about a dozen LPs of her stuff, sort of very low key, done in a local radio station. Yeah, I think the two quotes at the end here are really lovely. Jay's quote, her singing style can be considered both modest and attractive, certainly neither pretentious nor mannered. Her tunes seldom seem fragmentary, distorted, or deteriorated, and are uniformly delivered with confidence and clarity, and almost never vary substantially from the first stanza to the last. I love this quote from her. I'd sing it the way they had sung it. It wasn't a song. To me, it was an ancestor. Okay. Mantle So Green I wanted to include because we'd heard a version from New Brunswick a couple of forums ago, and this is quite a different tune. So I'm going to play the field recording. We'll just listen to a couple of verses of it.
Don't have any sound yet.
Can you hear it?
No.
Oh, sorry, I have to share the computer sound. That's a whole other operation I always forget. I don't know if anyone can quickly remind me how to do that.
At the bottom of the share screen.
Pardon?
It's at the bottom of the share screen.
My screen sharing seems to stop. Okay. Are you still seeing my screen at this point?
No. No, we're not.
I'm sorry. Let's just, at the bottom of the share screen, I'm a little lost at the moment. Advanced sharing options, multiple participants. I can usually get that sound shared quite easily.
On the same screen as you choose which window to use.
Right.
On the bottom of that screen.
I'm not even sure why it's not sharing anymore. Microsoft PowerPoint. Oh, right. Okay. But I'm not seeing that option at all. I shared the PowerPoint.
Yes, we've got the PowerPoint back.
Share computer sound. Okay, it's in a different place on my screen. Okay, let's see if this works.
As I went out one morning, morning in spring, to hear the nightingale whistle and the mockingbird sing, I spied a pretty fair maid. She appeared like some queen, in her costly fine robes and her
Oh, I'm sorry. I tried to switch back to the slideshow.
As I went out one morning in spring, to hear the nightingale whistle.
Okay, we'll stop there. Sorry, I didn't know that would affect the sound. I was trying to just get back to the full screen of the thing. Okay, so you get the idea. Yes.
We got time to play a bit more of that if you want to. Go ahead. It was nice.
Okay, but it will start over. I think.
That's all right. That's fine. Play it again.
I can go a little further in. Yeah.
I'll dress you in rich attire. You'll appear like some queen, in your costly fine robes and your mantle so green. I said, my dearest young man, oh, I must be excused, and I'll tell you the reason why I must refuse. Through green groves I've wandered for to shun all men's view, since the lad I love dearly is at the famed Waterloo.
Anyway, we do have one more song to go, so I'll leave it there. We all know that story of the broken ring, even though there's no ring actually involved in this particular one, but it's the same idea. He comes back in disguise. They end up getting married and living happily ever after. Good. I'll just go on to the third song here. This is one of my favorites because I love songs about women dressing up in men's clothing. I love the whole history of it in real life as well as in ballads. This one has a particular Canadianism at the end, as you can see, and it's one of those, I think, verses of verite that Vic was talking about, which is another reason I love the song, Cursed, cursed be the day that ever war began. So I'll just play this whole thing because it's short, and that'll be the end of my presentation for the day. Here we go.
Oh, hark, my love, the drums do beat, and I must haste away. The bugle sweetly sounding, I can no longer stay. For I am bound for Portsmouth, 'tis many a long, long mile, to join the British Army on the banks of the Nile. I'll dress myself in velveteen, I'll go along with you. I'll volunteer as servant, I'll go to England too. I'll fight beneath your banners, in fortune on you smile. I'll be your loving comrade on the banks of the Nile. Your fingers are too slender, love, your waist it is too small. Your precious form it is too weak to stand a cannonball. Your precious form it is too weak to stand such a hard climate of the sultry suns of Africa, your precious blood to spoil. Oh, cursed, cursed be the day that ever war began. It's taken away from Canada full many a gallant man. It's taken away our home guard, protectors of our soil, and their bodies feed the worms now on the banks of the Nile.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was great. That was that Lorena Clark singing that last one?
Yes, she was singing both of those last two.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's not surprising that Edith was taken with her, is it? That was wonderful.
She sang very simply and very clearly, great pitch. Yeah, very consistent.
Yeah, that's something special. Thank you, Anne. Anne's going to come back in a future Zoom meeting with some more things from Ontario. That was just part one. But we're going to move on now to Irene Shettle for our last session for today. Are you there, Irene?
I'm muting myself now.
There you are.
Yes, hello. Just going to try and share my screen. Whoops, come on. Okay, that's that and that. Let's go to slideshow.
Yeah, we have something.
Yeah, it's just trying to find it underneath everything else. That's it. Right, okay. Like Cara, I've tried to fit a quart into a pint pot, so this may go on a bit longer than it should, but my apologies on that score. Anyway, to start off with, on the 27th of December 1903, Vaughan Williams, who was then about 31, met two elderly men in the very small hamlet of Broadmoor. That's near Dorking in Surrey, and it's about 1.5 miles away from his home at Leithill Place. And the men in question were both first cousins. They were Henry Gammon, who was then 74, and Isaac Longhurst, who was slightly younger at 71. Both of them were local agricultural labourers, and it's possible that Isaac was already known to Vaughan Williams because his father had actually worked on Lethal Place estate.
Irene,
Why Vaughan Williams was actually meeting the two men in Broadmoor isn't really clear.
Irene, can you hear me? Irene.
Can you get closer to your mic?
Irene, can you hear me?
But there is a Frederick Longhurst who's living in the hamlet who might possibly have been a distant relative of Isaac's. I'm still checking that one out. Henry Gammon actually lived in a small hamlet of only 3 or 4 cottages.
Irene.
Further away.
Hello.
It's on the border
Irene.
of the Jays Park estate. Those are the sheep green cottages taken a few years ago. The general vicinity they were in, if I can find my cursor.
Irene, can you hear us? Can you hear me, Irene?
Well, if you can see on the left-hand side, you've got Forest Green. That's where Isaac lived. Up at the top of the screen, you've got Leesville Place. And then down to the right, you have another red cross, which is Sheep Green Cottages, which is on the borders of Jays Park Agricultural Estate. Broadmoor was actually further up to the right-hand corner of the screen. On that visit, Vaughan Williams actually took down a number of songs from both men. He took down 2 from Isaac Longhurst and another 6 from Henry. But he returned to see them again in May 1904, but this time at Forest Green, which was Isaac's home. And this is the point where I jettison Isaac and concentrate on Henry. The songs which Vaughan Williams noted down from Henry were a good old mixed bag. There are a couple of standards like The Bold Fisherman, a couple of hunting songs, a couple of broadside ballads, and I think my favourite, purely because of the title, it's recorded there as The Dragoon and the Lady, sometimes known as The Bold Grenadier, but Henry was singing it as The Dragon and the Lady, and I just love that. I picked 2 particular songs to look at. The first of those is probably the better known. It's The Ploughboy's Dream. And there you see the broadside ballad, which was published. We cannot hear Irene. By the Chief Repository for Moral and Religious Tracts.
Yes, we know that, Conrad. We're trying.
An organisation associated with the Sunday School movement. And not surprisingly, given the organisation, the song has got quite a moral little story to it. The words were actually written.
People can turn up the volume on their own machines. That works.
No, we cannot. Vaughan Williams took down the tune and the words of 5 verses of the song. And at the bottom of the verses, he actually inscribed unfinished. It's not clear whether that was because Henry couldn't remember the rest of the words or whether he just decided that was the finish of what he wanted to take down. The words which Gammon sang were actually, with only a couple of exceptions, identical to the 18th century ballad, which suggests to me that Henry probably had a pretty good memory for detail. If we look at the close-up of the notes which Vaughan Williams made, you'll see there that he describes him as a labourer of Forest Green, about 60, and in modern parlance, quite fake news. Henry was, as I've said, 74 at the time, so Vaughan Williams may have been no judge of ages. He was also, as far as I've managed to establish, not either living or working in Forest Green. The one that was Isaac. The tune of the song itself was what Vaughan Williams later used, a couple of years later in fact, for his arrangement of O Little Town of Bethlehem under the name of Forest Green. It's since been used for quite a number of other things as well. Going back, if we look at the second line there, Mr. Gammon used to sing to the Reverend John Broadwood, who would give half a crown to hear the Ploughboy's Dream, which has an exclamation mark after it. That maybe the half crown now has got spending power of about £7 to £13, so it wasn't a small sum, which suggests to me that the Reverend John Broadwood either liked the song an awful lot or he was very keen on Henry singing, or both. There's also the very outside possibility that that exclamation mark means that Henry was trying to get some monetary recompense for singing to him, but that's just pure speculation on my part. Broadwood had actually published, that's at Limehouse, where the Broadwood family home. Broadwood actually was a pioneer of the folk song collecting movement, and Vaughan Williams recognised that in his notes. And he published Old English Songs privately in 1847. That's often described as the first true collection of English traditional songs. Several generations of the Broadwoods were interested in local singers and song. Lucy obviously is the best documented of them, and she recorded that she heard her Uncle John and her father going around the house and singing the rural songs, some of which they'd collected themselves. And there's evidence that her grandfather had also encouraged and appreciated the local singers. In his notes, Vaughan Williams also recalls that Mr. Gammon learnt the health song at suppers at Lyne. Now that's Lyne House, taken a few years ago. It actually was the residence of the Broadwoods from about the 18th century. It seems that the Broadwoods may very well have organised these suppers for the locals over the years, because there's record of Lucy some years later performing at one of them in her teens. The mystery is, why was Henry at Lyne House? Well, the census of 1861 gives some possible indication, because if you look there, the highlighted line towards the bottom, it's Maria Gammon. She was 23 and a housemaid and living at Lyne and a servant for John Broadwood. I've done some research, and Maria turns out to be Henry's first cousin. So it's possible that she may have been his in to those suppers, but again, that's just supposition, I don't know. There's also the possibility that Henry did live fairly locally to Lyne, so he might have been invited anyway. I decided to look at the health song because I was intrigued with the Broadwood connection, and that was what I found. There are another 3 or 4 verses. Vaughan Williams has titled it Health Song or Harvest Home, and the other verses are very much a typical Harvest Home song. But I sight-read the tune and I looked at the words and I thought, I know this. And when I looked at it and checked it out, yes, I did. It's Henry Purcell's Come Ye Sons of Art, which intrigued me. There are a couple of things which cropped up. Firstly, Vaughan Williams made absolutely no reference to that in his notes. He's made no comment at all. And it seems he didn't recognise it for what it was, judging by the title he's given it. It's probably not surprising, because in 1903 early music was an extremely niche form of music, hardly performed. However, Lucy was a member of the Purcell Society, and she'd had early music songs in her performance repertoire for some time. And he did credit her in a letter in the 1920s with introducing him to Purcell, Bach, and folk song when he was much younger. Although sadly he doesn't say how much younger in his letter, but I suspect that that introduction was still to come. There's secondly the fact that Henry had learnt the song at Lyne. It was, as I said, only 1 verse long. I do wonder if he liked it sufficiently to want to sing it, but therefore needed some extra verses to make up the weight. Whether that was him that added those 4 verses to it, or somebody else, who knows, but he obviously did like it enough to sing it. And I would say, judging from the various songs, he probably had a very good ear for a very good tune. John Broadwood actually died in 1864, so that would have made Henry in his 30s when he was singing to him, and probably in his singing prime at the time. 40 years later, on meeting Vaughan Williams, he was actually still singing and working, and in his early 70s. So what do we actually know about Henry? That isn't him. That's just a representation of a Carter of the time, and he is the Carter of the title. I managed to establish that he was the 6th of 15 children of Francis and Hannah Gammon, and Francis in turn was one of 11 children of his own father. So there was a huge extended Gammon family in the area, and all the males in the family without exception were employed as agricultural labourers, while the women either married or went into service. Life would have been very tough for them. Agricultural wages were low and the hours were long. And indeed, Henry's father actually had to apply to the Corn Oil Union on more than one occasion for support for his family. The work obviously was pretty backbreaking, and they were out in all weathers and all seasons. There were obviously no modern pension schemes to fall back on, so they would probably be working from the cradle to the grave. And according to the census in 1901 and Vaughan Williams' notes in 1903, Henry was still working on the land in his early 70s. He was actually baptised in Horsham in 1829, but by the time he was 10, the family had moved to Oakwood in Surrey, which was just a little bit further south from where he ended up. In 1851, he can be tracked down to Southwark in London, where he's actually recorded as a 20-year-old carpenter under the surname of Penrose. There's no explanation why that is, but does seem to be a Penrose association with his family. There was a Susanna Holland from Hockley who was working in Southwark as a servant, and their marriage banns were read in Southwark in November 1858, this time under Henry's real surname, and they were married in Dorking area the same year. But by 1861, 3 years later, they'd moved back to Surrey. They were living in Ockley, and in 1871, they appear in the census returns living at Sheep Green. And that was where Henry was to remain until the year of his death. The immediate neighbours in the group of 4 cottages were agricultural labourers of one sort or another, so it seems likely to me that these were actually tied cottages. They were on the boundary of the Jays agricultural estate, and we do know from the newspaper report from 1890 that Henry was definitely employed on the estate because he's named as one of 6 elderly workers from the estate who were actually acting as pallbearers at the funeral of the owner, Mr. Lee Steer. So if they were tied cottages, it seems to me that that probably indicates that Henry was a very long-term employee there. The census returns show that he was an agricultural labourer, but by 1881 he appears as a carter. And I've spoken to his great-grandson, John Gammon in Falmouth, who's confirmed that it does seem to be a feature that Henry was proud of because they still have the plumes that Henry used to adorn his horses for special occasions. And carters at the time were a cut above the ordinary agricultural labourer, and they would receive higher wages. So I think it's probably not unlikely that he would have been proud of the job, no doubt proud and fond of his horses, given the fact that he retained those plumes. But by 1901, the census shows him as having reverted to being an ordinary labourer. I did wonder whether in fact that might have been because he wasn't actually up to the rigours of being a carter anymore. On the family side, from 1860 to 1869, he and his wife had 4 children. There were 2 daughters, one married a farmer, and the other went into service. 2 sons, Phineas and James, who trained as carpenters and moved to Guildford, and both were members of the local volunteer fire brigade. But unlike his father and grandfather, his family remained at a small size of 4. That may not have been by design because his wife suffered mental problems over several years and was eventually admitted to the mental asylum in Brookwood in Surrey, some 20 miles from Sheep Green. She died there nearly a quarter of a century afterwards, designated as a pauper patient, and only a few months after Henry. And her illness was quite extreme from her case notes, with very disturbing symptoms, and I think today she would have been diagnosed as having postnatal psychosis. We've got no means of knowing whether Henry was ever able to visit her. Some asylums did permit visitors, but it was quite often not encouraged, so we don't know if he ever saw her again. He remained at Sheep Green, and in 1901 his daughter-in-law is shown as being on the premises with him. So the burning question, obviously, is did he ever hear what Vaughan Williams had done with his song tune? And the sad answer for that one is no. Forest Green as an arrangement was published in the English Hymnal in 1906, and the transcript of the Ploughboy's Dream appeared in the Folk Song Journal in the same year. But unfortunately, by the time that they were both published, Henry had been dead for several months. He actually died on Boxing Day 1905, 1 day short of the 2nd anniversary of Vaughan Williams visiting him and collecting from him. And out of curiosity, I sent for his death certificate. I was rather saddened and shocked by what I read when I received it the week before Christmas 2 years ago. And if you can see there, the reason for the cause of death was strangulation, suicide whilst of unsound mind. That immediately sent me scurrying off to see if I could find a copy of the inquest. And indeed I did so. And it proved that on the day in question, Henry had died at his son James's home, that's James, and that James had found him in the early morning and had rushed off to find a doctor, and they attempted to revive him for nearly an hour, but with no luck. It apparently had been the case that he'd been diagnosed with epilepsy 10 years previously, so the family had tried to ensure that he wasn't left on his own too much. and he appears to have had an epileptic fit during the night, which would have meant that he wouldn't have known what he was up to. So hence the coroner's judgment that at the time he was of unsound mind. Pretty sad end. His burial actually took place 2 days later, and the sad fact is that we don't know where he's buried. My suspicion, and I think I'm 99% correct, is that he's buried in the Mount Cemetery on the other side of the river in Guildford, and just 10 minutes up the hill from where I live now. The cemetery actually had a fire in the 1930s which destroyed most of their records. The current database has no record of him, and there are no gravestones with his name on them. His son Phineas, though, was actually buried in that cemetery. I think he's probably destined not to be found. On an interesting point, neither of his surviving descendants that I've spoken to, Eric or Dom, was actually aware that Henry had sung. They weren't aware that he'd met Paul Williams, and they had no idea that their family had any association with the little town of Bethlehem. So at the end of it all, I think the only memory he has, the memorial I beg pardon, he has, is his name in association with the carol, a little town of Bethlehem, and obviously also the Ploughboy's Dream, because of his part when we would read the song tune for the little town of Bethlehem. I think probably for me, as he was a singer and probably had quite a hard and sad life on occasions, it's a rather fitting and appropriate memorial to have. So thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Can you hear me, Irene? Irene, can you hear me? Irene, can you? Right, that explains it. Irene, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Right, I'm sorry to tell you that the sound was very bad.
Oh.
So
I take my earplug out.
Yeah, and we were trying to attract your attention to say that, but you've taken your earplug out. So a lot of people couldn't hear you, and for some of us it was very muffled. So
that's sad.
It's sad because what I did hear was very interesting indeed. Have you got it written out?
Yeah.
Would you be willing for us to send that to all the participants?
Absolutely, yes. It's an actual sort of diminution of an hour-long talk I do on the history of O Little Town of Bethlehem, which goes into the whole history of the carol moving forward, and then also quite a bit more about Henry, who fascinates me.
Well, yes, obviously so. Well, if you wouldn't mind sending us the text, then we'll send it out with the next, Martin, if that's all right, we'll send it out, or send a link, or we'll get it to everybody somehow, because it was fascinating. Thank you.
Well,
sorry we couldn't get you.
Well, at least I managed to get the picture of his son James up.
Yes.
I've got a picture of both of his sons, Phineas. This is just sort of taking up time, I realise, but it's a fascinating fact that my sister is a fire historian. My father was as well. My father had a huge collection of photographs of fire brigade personnel going back to the 19th century. And there was one amongst them that we couldn't identify. We'd researched a lot of stuff to do with the family, the Gammons. I found a newspaper report of Phineas, the son, who was important in the local fire brigade. Found a photograph in the newspaper article, and the photograph my father had had for some years turned out to be Phineas. So suddenly, sort of, I'd got something to do with the whole thing in my family collection. Yeah.
So we need more singing firemen is obviously what we need. Right, if anybody wants to ask questions of any of the four speakers, we've got 20 minutes left. You have to raise your little blue hand by going down to participants, if I remember rightly. I can't do it because I'm a co-host. But if you want to raise your hand, please do. And we have Paul Mansfield is our first victim. Hello, Paul. Unmute yourself, Paul. Unmute.
Is that okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question for Vic. I just wanted to ask whether he thought that kind of verse that kind of puts the rest of the song into a different context had anything in common with those verses that sometimes occur at the end of songs that give a kind of moralistic conclusion to the song, such as, you know, when I'm dead, you can say I was a wild and wicked youth. And I've heard that those moralistic endings were kind of more popular in the United States. I can't remember, that might have even come up in one of these talks before. And the other thing I wondered if it had any similarity with is the way that singers use a verbal introduction to frame a song.
Interesting questions. Well, I think, you know, there's this opportunity to generalize. It's not that common in songs, but it is there. The moralistic ending, it's quite a lot of broadside material has that. I mean, the one you quoted, The Wild and Wicked Youth, you know, occurs on quite a lot of broadsides. I don't know, really. You know, there's a sense in which we always make some overall sense out of songs, even if it isn't made explicit. In these cases, it's sort of made explicit and definite. I mean, it can kill a song to moralise too much. I find that with some modern songwriters. But what was the second question? I can't remember now. I've got very bad short-term memory.
I was just asking whether it's got anything in common with the way that a singer would give a verbal introduction to a song.
Yeah, well,
so for example, you know, if there's a case of violence, men against women, for example, because that might be controversial nowadays, you might kind of give a sort of almost disclaimer type introduction to it.
In the past. I mean, the framing of songs is interesting. I mean, I did some work on street ballad singers, and they often have in some, again, the broadside material often have a verse, you know, come gather, you know, come all ye, come gather round and listen to this. I mean, there's often that way of establishing the song and setting it up. Yeah, I think that, you know, we just have to observe the material. It's there in all sorts of different ways, and really, really interesting, the way in which we make songs relate to people, you know.
Thank you. Victoria Bowden was next. Unmute yourself, Victoria. That's it.
Say who you are. Yeah. Hi, it's actually John. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes,
hello, good. John. I had to use Vic's because my laptop didn't work. Very quickly, can I say thank you very much to Martin and Shan for fitting me in at such short notice, and to all four speakers, because it's been a fascinating set of talks, and I could hear Irene's quite clearly as well, with my ear quite close to the screen. So all of them. I'd just like to comment on Anne's presentation, if I could. Thank you, Anne, for bringing attention to Lorena Clark. As Irene and some other people know, I've been singing Lorena's praises for many, many years. Absolutely brilliant and a very interesting talk. But it might have struck some people as odd that the way that she sings Her Mantle So Green was so lively and fast and sort of buoyant, because usually, of course, that is a very sad song, and it has an appropriately sad tune. And one thing that you mentioned earlier on, Anne, was that she uses the same tune for several songs sometimes. And actually, the tune to Her Mantle So Green is the one that she uses for What I Once Loved the Last, which Edith Folk calls light-hearted. It's about there are plenty more fish in the sea, and if I can't get one woman, then there are plenty more.
No, it's not, is it?
Yeah, so it's very odd, isn't it, that sometimes she uses what might seem an inappropriate tune for a song, even though the tune itself is good. It certainly fits I Once Loved the Last, but it seems an odd choice to go with Her Mantle So Green. Do you think?
Yeah, there's not only me, but lots of people have noted that in these old songs in Canada, there's almost a bit of perversity in that a very sad story will have a cheerful, tossed off tune, and sometimes a very lighthearted story will have, you know, a darker kind of modal tune and be sung slowly. So, you know, I used to wonder about this when I first started to explore this tradition, wondering if there was some kind of attempt on the part of the singer to work against the effect of the words, to not marry a sad tune with a sad set of words, and vice versa. If you had those lovely minor or modal tunes, you saved those for subject matter that wasn't too intense or too sad. It just seemed odd, and it's hard for us these days when I didn't know that this was different. For example, in Britain, I kind of assumed that maybe this was true for the whole traditional British Isles song repertoire, because revivalists, of course, do want to explore the dramatic possibilities of every song, so we're much more likely to mix and match, including me at times, I have to admit. We'll mix and match tunes differently to get more of the emotional effect you might want.
Yeah, I got the impression with Irene sometimes that she knew so many songs and maybe didn't know the tunes from them. She wanted to get them all out there, because sometimes she uses the same tune 3 or 4 times for different songs, doesn't she? It's as if she's saying, I've got this song and, you know, it fits this tune, so I'd rather get it out, because she brought out lots of her own LPs, didn't she, where she wanted to get all the material.
Yeah, she says that she is singing them the way she learned them from her older relatives. So I don't know if that's always true, that she would remember every tune. So I don't know whether she's responsible for that or some of her older relatives were for using the same tune for many songs, vice versa. I can't say.
Thank you, Anne. We'll have to move on. I've got a whole queue of blue hands here. John Baxter, you're next. Try and keep it brief if you can, everybody. Hi, John.
Hi. Yeah, it was just in response to Vic's talk, that sort of moral tone of that first verse. There's something about Victorian song where they just loved a motto song, a moral song, particularly in the music hall, and quite a lot of them have survived and are still sung in folk circles today. I mean, things like Paddle Your Own Canoe, or Where There's a Will, There's a Way. And it's just to link it to the Canadian songs, quite a lot of the Edith folk stuff that is unattributed well, not quite a lot, a proportion of it, I don't want to overstate, but a proportion of it can be traced back to the music hall, and quite a few of them are these sort of you know, work hard and everything will be all right sort of songs. So there's always been a sort of strain of those sort of songs within the tradition, I think.
I think that's right, and I mean, the interesting thing is the way that this, you know, we talk about the music hall, which essentially dates from the 1830s, 40s, 50s, but of course we're 100 years before that, and yet here is a theatre song coming, you know, and gaining a sort of popular circulation and really, you know, grabbing hold for a long period of time. So I think, you know, we have to look at all the ways. I mean, what really interests me is the way that, you know, we talk about an archaeology of the repertories, how the songs of people come from different times and periods, but the songs themselves sometimes have this archaeology, these different layers within them, and I find that quite fascinating. But you're absolutely right. I mean, different periods do have different sort of moods of songs that they pump out, but you know, the way in which Dibdin's patriotic songs in the late 18th century were all the rage. But I think it's really interesting that when these things grab hold and last a long time, that's what really fascinates me. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Vic and John. David Atkinson, you're next. Mute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the discussion of Vic's song. When I first heard that, you know, listening to particularly the Joan Baez thing, that verse struck me as entirely different in tone from the moralistic comments that we tend to associate with the end of especially 18th century broadside ballads, which are usually very closely tied to the story and derive pretty straightforward religious moral from it, whereas that verse is much more sort of abstract, addressing a generalized sort of social issue, which seemed to me to, let's say it was a thought that that fits better with the sort of theatrical ambience. I mean, I was quite surprised to find that it was so early. I wondered if it was a sort of fairly recent kind of composition. But the other thing that comes from that, and that it appears to have survived through all those fairly large songbooks, the goldfinch, the thrush, the blackbird, the linnet, the nightingale, the robin, all those kinds of things. And those are all genuine titles. I'm not just making them up. Which, as Vic said, we tend to think of as a middle class, or aimed at a middle class, if there was such a thing in the 18th century. So it's kind of interesting that that may have, and they were certainly more expensive than your average broadside or chapbook. It's kind of interesting that that might have fed into what we now sort of think of as folk song, working class song, or whatever. Anyway, that's more of an observation than a question.
No, that's right. Steve Gardner, I think, is on the line, told me that he'd seen it on broadsides. I never have seen it on a broadside, but maybe if Steve's there, he could say something.
Well, we're going to have to move on because I've got a queue of people. So I'm going to go on to Brian Peters. Brian, come on, wake up, Brian.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still on the on Vic song as well, because I just got my copy of Cecil Sharp's Folk Songs of the Southern Appalachians down, and in fact, actually, that first verse is not associated with most of the versions of the song that are in there, but somewhere there must be, and maybe Steve Garden would know this, the horse song, because there are other horse verses that turn up in these. So somewhere there is a coherent horse song to which that hard is the fortune verse could get added, or on top of Old Smoke it could get added. So I'm assuming nobody has managed to trace the horse song yet.
It crops up in a lot of other American songs. I'm a rambler, I'm a gambler. There's another one as well. Again, but it seems to float around different songs there. I think it's American. And what we didn't find, and Steve confirmed this, I'd never found it in an English or British source, and Steve Gardner hadn't either. He's the sort of absent presence, isn't it, at present? I think you ought to say something.
No, I think we've got to move on. Therese McIntyre.
Hang on, unmute.
Hi there.
Oh yeah. First of all, well done to everyone. I suppose my question is for Cara, because I think our work probably overlaps a little bit. Do we have any, I suppose, folkloric evidence in terms of how the community actually viewed Michael Hayes, say, after the ballad was written? And I'm kind of thinking along Dermot O'Gillen's line of that it was the community that determined whether or not an individual was a hero. And it's interesting you bring the media into it, because initially the media is against him, and then of course it flips the other way. And it's always convenient with composers in that they leave out the inconvenient truths about an event in order to portray a person. There's a ballad about the Mam Trosna murders that does the same thing as well. And I'm wondering if we have any accounts from the community itself in terms of how the people actually viewed Michael Hayes.
That's a really good question, and I'm working on that. I was sort of trying to find my way into figuring out how people thought about him at the time, and the newspaper is that's sort of the easier way to get into it, because that's readily available. But I'm wondering the same thing, and I'm wondering if whether the paper, the media's change of opinion maybe reflects a little bit the opinion of the people to some extent as well, just from the kind of papers that bring that change in. I'm thinking that might be the case, but that's just a hypothesis at this point. So yeah, this is kind of a new song for me in terms of what I'm tackling right now. So I'm looking for exactly what you're mentioning. So to be continued. We'll find more about that as we go along.
Thank you, Cara. Julie Hennigan. Unmute.
Yes, I'm trying. Thank you. Just a quick addition to what Vic was saying about American songs that have that kind of verse in them. I was thinking of Gene Ritchie's family version of Bachelor's Hall, and it has "Hard is my fortune and hard is my fate, controlled by my mother so early and late. When I get married, to stand all my strife, slave to my husband the rest of my life." And her version of Bachelor's Hall is mostly from a woman's point of view. But then you look at somebody like Fiddling John Carson's version, and it's from the man's point of view. So I like the term constellation as applied to these kinds of songs with floating verses like this. So that was all. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. Moving on quickly. Carol, you had your hand up, but it's gone again. Unmute.
Okay.
Hello.
I have first of all, thank you for this wonderful session. And thank you, Anita, for making me aware of it. I have a couple of versions of the Wagoner's Lad and Old Smoky that I'll send out, I'll copy. But the theme seems to be not so much a class-oriented theme of, you know, my parents didn't approve of him because he was poor, but rather he was an unconstant lover. You know, he loved me and went on to somebody else. So I thought that was sort of interesting, and I'll copy these and post them. They're from a couple of old ballad books that go back to my younger years. But anyway, I'll post them, and maybe it'll be of some interest.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Conrad, are you there, Conrad?
I'm muted now.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I don't have to turn anything up.
No.
All right. The first thing for Vic, the best recording of the Wagoner's Lad is really probably just only for men. It's done by Asleep at the Wheel, which is Western swing group from, I guess, 70s, 80s. Look that one up. It should be a male version only. It's quite a sultry song version. I remember it well. It's a good one.
Right.
The other thing is the transformation of characters from evil to bad, shifting gears, as it were. I'm not sure exactly what paper that involved, but the idea is, with us, is Guy Fawkes, of course, everything seems to be. He changes from being a devil incarnate to being a highwayman like Robin Hood, and then he changes then into a clown. All kinds of different actions are working on this. It's quite complicated, but it's as if they go into some sort of closet, onto a shelf, and they say, who wants to wear this costume today? And generally, Guy Fawkes was made into all of the politicians who are evil got to be Guy Fawkes and put on the costume for a while. And these things change and are very dynamic, but it's what's going on underneath all of the lyrics, and to see how society does really change the use and function as it moves ahead. Same with music hall. Music hall is often just described as music hall. Music hall is quite complex. It starts off being quite close to the people, and then it's sort of a parlor music aspect to it, and then moves on into sort of a storefront where it's more formal, and then it falls out of favor with the lower classes and ordinary people and becomes trendy among the aristocracy. And then they have chains all over England. It becomes like a supermarket thing, very commercialized, and the songs are not anymore local. And that at that time, the music retreats into the darkness of the pubs and then into the parlors where it keeps going for quite a while. Music hall, of course, Tommy Armstrong did music hall. He did meetings, and he was an entrepreneur at his time.
Okay, Conrad, I'm going to have to stop you there. We're going to be talking about music hall the next session, so thank you for that. And Lisa, are you still there, Lisa? Now, for the last on my list. Lisa, you have 10 seconds. And you're not muted. You're muted. You're still
Just
muted.
a brief comment with relationship to the paper on Lorena Clark and the disjunction between the tunes. I wanted to insert a posthumous comment I once heard folklorist James Griffith make at a conference I went to in Arizona, who was looking particularly at American cowboy songs and songs of the Southwest, at how important it was, and I think it could be applied across many genres of American song and perhaps Canadian singing, of trying to distance yourself from the atrocities and the horrors of executions, of murders, the importance of trying to get it, using the tunes as a form of distancing yourself so that you're narrating. There's a very often in the revival, there's an attempt to recreate these scenes, but he used to demonstrate how horrible it was to recreate a murder ballads and the use of tunes specifically to essentially narrate the song, not re-impersonate the song. So that's the only contribute. That's a posthumous observation from James Griffith.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, James Griffith. And thank you, everybody, especially our 4 speakers today. A round of applause again. Our sort of silent waving of hands that we do every time. Thank you to everyone for taking part. We're going to be back on September the 20th with another 4x4 session, and keep an eye out for the newsletter and so on that comes from Martin about Wednesday or so. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. Bye for now.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.